Maybe the greatest arcade mode in Overwatch history just dropped. It's called Junkenstein's Laboratory, and it's a part of Season 13's Halloween event. And oh my gosh, is it absolutely phenomenal. It's a familiar take on talent, skill trees, and hero variations, but it's something we've never quite seen in this exact setup. It's a fleshed out Overwatch, it's wildly imbalanced, it's completely nonsensical, but it's also a lot of fun. Basically, you get the opportunity to pick any 3 tanks, 5 DPS, or 4 supports, and then when you lock the character, you get to select 2 new pretty crazy upgrades you get to lock for your character that are unique to your character, unlike pickable passives. And then as each round of King of the Hill progresses, you're able to select and add another skill that slowly level up, not only in terms of potency, but in rarity as well. This leads to some interesting dynamics where you're able to kind of flesh out your character in different directions depending on the RNG of which cards that you get and which style of your characters do you want to lean into. Do you want to lean into the more spamming fire strikes with lava pouring from each fire strike and then getting those fire strikes back faster as Reinhardt? Or do you want to be the ultimate shield bot with a bigger, more healthy shield and even a shield while you're pinning? You see, you can do any and all of these things, and the variety is remarkably fleshed out for a silly arcade mode, which raises some questions about where did all this come from. More on that later. What you need to know is what's so great about this game mode compared to a lot of other arcade modes. And I think the big thing that stands out to me is it still feels relatively like Overwatch. It's imbalanced, nonsense, silly Overwatch with limited characters, but it's still Overwatch. So if you're like me and you don't enjoy many of the player versus environment modes like Junkenstein's Lab and even some of the weirder ones like Lucio Ball, which are fun in their own rights, but just don't really have the replayability, this is still Overwatch, and there's a lot of characters to try out, and even there's a lot of builds to try out with the same characters, so the replayability and the freshness of it sticks with it more so than really any arcade mode that I've played in all of Overwatch's history. There's a ton of new toys, the freshness of it means that it's not solved for quite some time, and there's even some ideas that feel like it could be implemented into the game. So most of the cards are complete and utter nonsense, but there's a couple of those things that made me pause and go, man, I would actually like to see that with this character in the actual live game. Now, obviously it's not perfect. It definitely can be optimized the more that you play it, and after playing a character several times, you get a pretty good vibe of what cards you need to be going with. And there's even some situations where because you cannot swap your character, you might have picked the wrong character in the wrong situation versus the wrong comp, and you're kind of stuck with that. And the way that you have to adjust may not be all that interesting. I found when I'm playing versus like a Pharah, Zenyatta, Diva as Reinhardt, leaning into fire strikes is generally not the play, and I have to basically undo my build, be more defensive focused. And some heroes are certainly better than others. I think the tank pool is relatively balanced, if not always super fun. The DPS pool, though, feels a little bit top-heavy. I think Pharah is really good, Reaper's pretty weak. I think Mercy's fairly weak, Kiriko is really strong. At least these are just my initial impressions. I don't know how accurate they are. And finally, the hero selection isn't the best, especially for the support cast. I think Kiriko, Mercy, and Moira being 3 out of the 4 supports, just for me personally, kind of sucks. I would have loved to see some Ana, would love to see some Baptiste, maybe even some Brigitte, Lucio, something with a little bit more variety. But those are mostly minor nitpicks for an arcade mode that wasn't really intended to be super competitive or super strategically balanced. And honestly, despite all these shortcomings, it's still something that I've put in a lot of hours in. Honestly, even more than the original game. The question is, again, where did all this come from? I think the answer is some of this is probably some dregs left over from the previous PvE. I don't know how much of it is or not, but the way that it's implemented in PvP has been actually relatively interesting. It raises a lot of questions about future tests of things that they're going to be able to do. We see what Overwatch has not brought back is the testing server, but what they've done is they've run repeated experimental cards in Quick Play with Quick Play Hack. They've run things like Mirror Watch and content creator cards for Overwatch, and then even this, where it makes you wonder how many of these things are actually being tested for the live game. Is the format of picking and developing upgrades actually something they're looking to implement the real game, or are they just trying out little fun details to see if people like playing with them? You see, they definitely have statistics about what cards are being played, what cards are being picked, and the win rate of not only different characters, but probably the win rate of different talents that are selected too. For feedback to the developers, I would say I wouldn't necessarily want to see this kind of a system implemented into the main game, certainly. I think some ideas as they're testing, as I mentioned earlier, definitely could be implemented in the main game, but essentially the card and the RNG and the pick your talent system is fun, but it should probably be its own game mode if it's going to be something permanent in Overwatch. And I actually wonder if it probably should be. That being said, it's still a pretty good way where you could test out some fun new things and to see how they play out. It's a very fun side project depending on the developing hours being put into it, of course, and a lot of people just like playing Overwatch with their arcade, certainly me. If implemented sideways alongside the normal Overwatch, I could definitely be very open to this idea of the card system. I think we'll need to experiment more with what cards are appropriate. I found that there were a couple of cards that were just objectively bad. And I think that if you're going to be having this card system, you need to kind of aim for one of two categories, either really good cards or really silly and fun cards. And some of the cards were bad and they weren't particularly fun either. And I think those are the cards that we want to avoid. I think the hero selection can still be a bit of an issue as well if this is something that we wanted to revisit moving forward. Obviously, this is more my personal bias. I know character pick rates of heroes like Mercy are really high, but also having Moira in there and Kiriko would not have been my first choices. And also, in addition to that, the balance of the power selection does seem to lean a little bit into defensive measures, not only for tanks, but for DPS and supports as well. Having basically a permanent healing station running around with you, soldier providing defensive incoming damage reduction is a bit odd. It's fun, but it definitely could be a little bit overbroken when stacked. And overall, the power scale of some characters definitely gets out of balance as well. By the end game, Kiriko generally becomes honestly the best character in the entire game with tri-shot and explosive shot on those weapons that also have faster projectiles as well. It gets to be kind of silly. But all those criticisms aside, if this is a realm where Overwatch can test new ideas for the base game, if this is something they're going to be looking to implement sideways to the base game, and even if this is just something occasionally brought in for fun and there's no ulterior motive, there's nothing to learn, it's just good, honest fun, well then big thumbs up for me. This is, again, the most fun I've had. If you haven't tried this out, you need to get a couple of friends, queue up, queue for different roles, try the same hero that you like and try different builds because it's different every single time, and honestly give it a shot. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, but honestly this one was a huge win for me.